The October wind cut across the Anderson family farm like a knife. Carried with it the scent of ripe corn and the weight of 150 years of history. Luke Anderson stood at the edge of his 800 acres, watching the golden stalks sway in rhythmic waves, calculating the harvest that would determine whether his family's legacy survived another generation. His great-great-grandfather had broken this Iowa soil with a hand plow in 1870, and every Anderson since had bled into this land. But 3 consecutive bad harvests had left Luke drowning in debt that not even heritage could repay. The bank statement sitting on his kitchen table told a story his ancestors had never faced. Sell now or lose everything to foreclosure by Christmas. Behind him, his fiancée Ashley's Mercedes gleamed in his driveway, as out of place among the tractors as her designer heels were in the mud, but she held the key to his financial survival, or his ruin. In the workers' kitchen of the Anderson farmhouse, Rosa Mendez stood over an industrial-sized pot of pozo, stirring with the steady rhythm of someone who had fed hungry men all her life. Luke paid her cash under the table, $9 an hour to cook 3 meals a day for his harvest crew of 12, and treated her like furniture, rarely making eye contact when he grunted orders in his broken, condescending Spanish. She kept her eyes down and her mouth shut, the survival skills of an undocumented immigrant who knew that invisibility meant safety, even as her hands created meals that reminded her of a home she could never return to without risking her life. The kitchen smelled of hominy and chiles and memories, but Rosa had learned to lock away the past like the university degree she left behind in Mexico City when the cartel men came. She was nobody here, just another immigrant cook, and that anonymity was the only thing keeping her alive, even if it meant choking down the humiliation that came with Luke Anderson's casual cruelty every single day. Ashley Harper checked her reflection in her phone screen before walking into the farmhouse, her Louboutin heels sinking into the soft earth with each reluctant step. She'd grown up in Des Moines, the daughter of a dentist, and had spent her entire adult life trying to distance herself from anything that smelled like agriculture. But Luke Anderson represented the perfect consolation prize, a man who owned 800 acres of prime Iowa farmland that developers were circling like vultures. Her position as senior loan officer at Heartland First Bank had shown her exactly how deep Luke's financial hole went, and she'd carefully orchestrated his desperation over the past 2 years, denying restructuring options and inflating interest rates until selling was his only option. The Mega Farm Corporation AgriCorp had promised her a $200,000 finder's fee when Luke signed the papers, enough for her to finally leave this godforsaken state and start over in Chicago or New York. She smoothed her cream silk blouse, practiced her sympathetic expression, and opened a farmhouse door, ready to close the deal that would change her life, even if it destroyed his. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Luke Anderson had stopped counting the generations the moment the 3rd bad harvest nearly broke him, but his father's voice still echoed in his head every morning. And Anderson never sells. The 800-acre corn farm sprawled across the Iowa landscape like a patchwork quilt, each field a different shade of gold and green, representing decades of careful rotation and soil management that his ancestors had perfected through trial, error, and backbreaking labor. At 34, Luke had taken over the farm when his father died of a heart attack in the South 40, literally worked to death trying to save a failing crop. And Luke had promised at the grave that he'd never let the family legacy die. But promises didn't pay the $1.2 million in loans he'd taken out to upgrade equipment, combat 3 years of drought and flooding, and compete with industrial farms that operated on margin small farmers couldn't match. He stood in his office, the same room where his great-grandfather had tallied harvest by candlelight, and stared at numbers that told him everything his pride refused to accept. He was going under, and going under fast. His farmhouse reflected the contradictions of modern agriculture. Antique family photos on walls that needed painting, grandmother's china in cabinets next to a stack of unpaid bills, hand-carved furniture his great-great-grandfather had made sitting on floors that creaked with age and deferred maintenance. Luke had grown up knowing every inch of this land, had learned to drive a tractor before he could legally drive a car, had absorbed farming wisdom like other kids absorb video games. But none of it had prepared him for the ruthless economics of 21st century agriculture. The corporate mega-farms could take losses for years, subsidized by investors and tax breaks, while family farmers like him fought for survival every single season, one bad harvest away from extinction. He'd fired most of his year-round workers 2 years ago, keeping only a skeleton crew and hiring day laborers and immigrants during harvest season because they were cheaper and didn't require benefits. The guilt gnawed at him sometimes, late at night, but he'd swallowed it down with whiskey and told himself he was doing what he had to do to survive, even if it meant becoming the kind of man his grandfather would have been ashamed of. Ashley had been strategic about their relationship from the beginning, targeting him at a Farm Bureau meeting, where he'd been the youngest farmer in the room and the most vulnerable. She'd listened to his problems with practiced sympathy, offered financial advice that slowly tangled him deeper into her bank's web, and presented herself as a sophisticated woman who could elevate him beyond the mud and machinery that defined his existence. Her ultimatum had come 6 months ago, delivered over champagne at Des Moines' finest restaurant. Sell the farm, take the money, and start fresh in something modern and profitable, or watch her walk away to find a man with actual ambition. Luke had wanted to say no, had felt his ancestors' disappointment like physical weight. But Ashley knew exactly how to make him feel like a failure, a backwards hick clinging to a dying way of life, until selling almost felt like progress. She'd already lined up the buyer, AgriCorp, a massive agricultural corporation that was buying up family farms across the Midwest and converting them to industrial operations with hired managers and automated equipment. The papers sat in his office, needing only his signature to transfer 150 years of Anderson history into corporate ownership. And Ashley reminded him of this fact approximately every 4 hours, her patience wearing thinner with each passing day. The harvest crew arrived at dawn, a mix of local day laborers and immigrant workers who lived in the bunkhouse behind the barn and sent most of their wages home to families in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. Luke barely looked at them anymore, had stopped learning their names after the first year, treated them as interchangeable units of labor rather than human beings with their own stories and dreams. He'd hired Rosa Mendez through a crew boss 3 months ago when his previous cook quit, paying her cash and asking no questions about documentation because skilled cooks who'd work for $9 an hour didn't exactly grow on trees in rural Iowa. She was quiet, efficient, kept the kitchen clean and the men fed, and that was all he cared about. She was a means to an end, a budget line item, not a person worth his attention or respect. When he did speak to her, it was in the slow, loud English people use with foreigners they assume are stupid, or in his terrible Spanish that treated her language like a child's toy he could pick up and discard at will. Rosa took the disrespect in silence, her dark eyes downcast, her posture submissive, giving him no reason to look closer or wonder why a woman with her bearing and intelligence was willing to work for wages that barely covered her room and board in the drafty worker housing. The October morning was deceptive in its beauty, the kind of crisp autumn day that made farmers' hearts sing with thoughts of perfect harvest weather and premium prices. Luke walked the fields with his farm manager Tom, a grizzled 60-year-old who'd worked Anderson land for 40 years and knew every acre as well as Luke did, their boots crunching on frost-touched soil as they surveyed the corn that would determine their fate. The crop looked good, the best in 3 years, with full, heavy ears and strong stalks that had weathered a summer of adequate but not excessive rain, and commodity prices were climbing as exports to China resumed after trade war disruptions. If they could get this corn harvested and to market before the weather turned, Luke might actually make enough to pay down significant debt, buy himself another year, and tell Ashley and her buyer to go to hell. Looking at maybe $2 million gross, Tom said, chewing tobacco and squinting at the rows. After expenses, could clear $800,000. Ain't gonna solve all your problems, but it's a start. Luke allowed himself a moment of hope, rare and fragile as a soap bubble, imagining telling Ashley he wasn't selling, wasn't giving up, that Anderson farmers didn't quit, and then his phone buzzed with another text from her. Dinner tonight. Need to discuss the offer. Time's running out. That evening, Rosa prepared carnitas for the crew with the last of the pork shoulder Luke had grudgingly budgeted for, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she shredded meat and chopped cilantro and onions. The workers ate with the desperate hunger of men who'd worked 12-hour days in the fields, praising her cooking in Spanish, while Luke ate alone in the main house, reheating his portion in the microwave because sitting with the crew felt beneath him. Ashley arrived exactly on time, Her Mercedes somehow still pristine despite the dusty farm roads, carrying a leather portfolio that Luke knew contained the sale documents and probably a calculator to show him, again, why selling was his only rational choice. She kissed him with the clinical efficiency of someone checking off a task, her lips cold and her perfume expensive, a scent that had nothing to do with soil or growing things. "We need to talk about the AgriCorp offer," she said before she'd even remove her coat, her tone suggesting this was a conversation he'd been stupidly avoiding rather than a decision that would end his family's entire legacy. Luke poured himself a whiskey, his third of the evening, and settled in for another round of financial torture disguised as concern, while outside his window, Rosa cleaned the kitchen and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake coming to a place where she was even more invisible than she'd been back home. Ashley spread the papers across Luke's dining room table with the confidence of a woman who'd already won, her manicured fingers pointing to highlighted sections as she walked him through numbers he'd seen a dozen times before. AgriCorp was offering $4.2 million for the land, equipment, and buildings, a number that sounded enormous until you subtracted the $1.2 million in bank debt, the $400,000 he owed to equipment dealers and seed suppliers, the capital gains taxes, and the lawyer fees. "You'd walk away with maybe $2 million clear," Ashley explained with forced patience, as if he were a child struggling with basic math. "That's enough to start fresh. Buy a nice house in Des Moines, maybe invest in something stable like franchises or rental properties. You could actually have a life instead of slowly drowning out here." Her words carried the implicit threat. She was offering him a future that included her, but only if he made the smart choice, and the clock was ticking on both the offer and her willingness to tie herself to a failing farmer. Luke stared at the signature line, his mind filling with images of his father, his grandfather, the daguerreotype of his great-great-grandfather that hung in the hallway, all of them staring at him with disappointment that transcended death. "I just need this harvest," he said, hearing the weakness in his own voice. "One good harvest, and I can turn this around." Ashley's smile was practiced sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "Sweetheart, that's what you said last year, and the year before. At some point, you have to accept reality." The conversation ended like it always did. No decision made. Papers unsigned. Ashley's frustration barely concealed beneath her professional veneer. Luke pouring another whiskey and hating himself for his weakness, his indecision, his inability to either save the farm or put it out of its misery. After she left, kiss on the cheek, reminder that AgriCorp's offer expired in 2 weeks. Luke walked out to the fields in the darkness, needing to feel his land beneath his feet, to remember why any of this mattered beyond balance sheets and profit margins. The corn whispered in the night breeze, a sound his ancestors had heard for 150 years, a sound that connected him to something bigger than quarterly earnings or Ashley's ultimatums. In the worker housing, Rosa sat on her narrow bed and wrote an email to her sister in Oaxaca, carefully using public Wi-Fi from the library to avoid leaving digital traces that immigration authorities might follow, describing her days without mentioning the humiliation, the loneliness, the constant fear that one wrong move would end in deportation. She was surviving, which was all she'd hoped for when she fled Mexico 2 years ago. But survival and living were different things, and she couldn't remember the last time she felt truly alive rather than just functional. Tomorrow would be another day of invisibility, another day of being nobody, and she'd learned to accept that as the price of safety. But acceptance and happiness were also different things, and she allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of tears before washing her face and preparing for another dawn. Rosa Mendez woke at 4:30 every morning to an alarm that played norteño music at low volume, the rhythm reminding her of home even as it pulled her from dreams where she was still somebody who mattered. Her room in the worker housing was sparse, a single bed, a small dresser, a crucifix on the wall, and a locked footlocker under her bed that contained everything she'd managed to save from her previous life. Her UNAM degree in agricultural sciences, family photos, her father's journals about sustainable farming techniques passed down through 7 generations. She dressed in darkness, not wanting to wake the other workers, pulling on jeans and a sweater against the October cold that seeped through the building's inadequate insulation, tying her long black hair into a practical bun that would stay out of her face during hours of cooking. The mirror showed her a 31-year-old woman who looked older, worn down by 2 years of running and hiding and pretending to be less than she was. but her eyes still held intelligence that no amount of humiliation could quite extinguish. She crossed herself, whispered a prayer to La Virgin de Guadalupe, and walked across the frost-covered yard to the farmhouse kitchen, ready to become invisible again. The kitchen was her domain, the one place where she had some autonomy, even if Luke Anderson wouldn't have recognized it as such. She'd reorganized the industrial refrigerator for better food rotation, implemented a meal planning system that reduced waste by 30%, and introduced a crew to regional Mexican dishes that reminded them of home while staying within Luke's miserly budget. Her pozo had become legendary among the workers, rich with hominy and pork, seasoned with dried chives and oregano in proportions her grandmother had taught her, topped with fresh radishes and cabbage and lime, that transformed simple ingredients into something that tasted like love. She cooked with the precision of someone trained in chemistry and nutrition, understanding how proteins denatured and starches gelatinized, but she let the workers think she was just a good home cook because drawing attention to her knowledge would raise dangerous questions. The breakfast routine was automatic now. Coffee at 5, scrambled eggs with chorizo and tortillas at 6, fruit and yogurt for few workers who wanted lighter options, everything timed so the crew could eat and get to the fields by 7 when there was enough light to work safely. Luke Anderson entered his kitchen at 6:15 like a man walking through his own property, barely acknowledging Rosa's existence as he poured coffee and grabbed a plate of food. More salsa. He said in English, not please or thank you, or even making eye contact, just a command issued to someone he considered hired help without enough intelligence to warrant basic courtesy. Rosa reached for the salsa she'd made from fire-roasted tomatoes and handed it to him silently, her eyes downcast in the submissive posture she perfected over 2 years of invisibility. She wanted to tell him that she'd studied agricultural economics at one of Latin America's premier universities, that her family's farm had been featured in Mexican agricultural journals for its innovative sustainable practices, that she'd forgotten more about farming than he'd probably ever know. But instead she said yes, sir, and returned to flipping tortillas. The workers filtered through, thanking her warmly in Spanish, treating her with the respect Luke couldn't be bothered to show, and she smiled at them with genuine warmth because they understood what it meant to be invisible in someone else's country. Juan, the crew boss, always made sure she got a break and adequate supplies, and Maria, the only other woman worker, had become her friend, someone to talk to during the long evenings when homesickness hit, like a physical blow. Her past lived in the footlocker under her bed like a ghost. She visited only in private moments when the ache of everything she'd lost became too heavy to carry alone. The Mendez family had owned 200 acres in the valleys outside Oaxaca for 7 generations, growing corn and beans and squash using ancient agricultural techniques, combined with modern sustainable practices that had made them regional leaders in organic farming. Rosa had been groomed to take over the farm from childhood, learning soil science from her father and traditional knowledge from her grandmother, eventually earning her agricultural sciences degree from UNAM with honors, and returning home with dreams of expanding their operation and training other farmers in sustainable methods. For 3 years, everything had been perfect. Yields increasing, prices premium, her family's reputation growing, a marriage engagement to Miguel, a civil engineer who shared her vision of rural development and social justice. Then the Knights Templar cartel had expanded into Oaxaca, demanding protection payments that were really extortion, and her father had made the fatal mistake of refusing and organizing other farmers to resist. They found her father and Miguel in the South Field, executed with bullets to the head, their bodies left as a message that resistance meant death. The footlocker also contained her mother's final letter, written 3 days after the murders when the cartel men had come back and told Rosa she had exactly 1 week to sign over the farm to them or watch her mother and sisters die the same way. Rosa had done what her father would have wanted. She documented everything, sent the evidence to a journalist friend in Mexico City who published the story of cartel land theft, packed 1 bag, and disappeared into the Underground Railroad that smuggled threatened Mexicans across the border. Her mother and sisters had fled to cousins in Monterey, selling what little they could salvage, and Rosa had emerged in Texas with a coyote's help, $900 in her pocket, and instructions to never use her real credentials because immigration enforcement was monitoring professional databases for asylum seekers. For 2 years she'd moved through the Southwest doing the work invisible immigrants did: house cleaning, childcare, restaurant work, farm labor, Always paid in cash. Always using the fake name Rosa Martinez. Always one step ahead of fear that Icy would find her and send her back to certain death. The UNAM degree stayed locked away, worthless in a country that wouldn't recognize it anyway, while she pretended to be exactly what men like Luke Anderson assumed all Mexican immigrants were: uneducated, unskilled, grateful for whatever scraps Americans threw their way. But Rosa hadn't survived 2 years of running by being weak or stupid. She'd survived by being strategic, patient, and willing to endure humiliation as the price of safety. She studied Luke's farm operation with the trained eye of someone who understood agriculture at a level he couldn't imagine, noticing inefficiencies in his crop rotation, problems with his pest management, opportunities for better yield through precision agriculture techniques. His soil was tired from years of corn-soybean rotation without adequate cover cropping or nutrient replenishment. His equipment maintenance was reactive rather than preventative. His harvest timing was based on tradition rather than optimal moisture content analysis. She could have saved him thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, with simple changes. But telling him would mean revealing herself, and revelation meant risk, and risk meant death or deportation or both. So she stayed silent, cooked his meals, accepted his disrespect, and waited for what? She didn't even know anymore. Maybe just to survive another day, another week, another year in this half-life where she was nobody, going nowhere, with nothing except the locked memories of who she used to be and the fading hope that someday, somehow, she might reclaim even a fraction of her stolen life. The October days had a rhythm that Rosa had learned to appreciate despite everything. The pre-dawn darkness when the kitchen was hers alone, the satisfying work of feeding hungry people well, the afternoon hours when she could walk the farm's perimeter and pretend she was checking on her family's land instead of someone else's. She'd noticed things Luke apparently missed. Early signs of corn borer in the southeast section, nitrogen deficiency in the field near the creek, evidence that his irrigation system was distributing water unevenly and creating stress patterns that would reduce yield. Part of her wanted to tell him, the same instinct that had made her an excellent farm manager back home, but she'd learned the hard way that men like Luke didn't want advice from immigrant cooks, especially not women who were supposed to know their place. Maria had warned her about this when Rosa first arrived. They want us invisible. We cook, we clean, we work, we don't talk, we don't ask questions. We definitely don't tell them how to do their jobs. You understand? Rosa understood perfectly. It was the same dynamic she'd seen in Mexico between wealthy landowners and their workers, the same power structure that crossed borders and cultures, the same assumption that your social position determined the value of your knowledge and the worth of your voice. Her friendship with the workers' children had become Rosa's one source of genuine joy in an otherwise gray existence. 3 of the seasonal workers had brought their families north this year, living in the cramped worker housing and doing whatever jobs they could find in town, while the men worked Luke's harvest. Little Sophia, age 7, had latched onto Rosa immediately, following her around the kitchen and begging for cooking lessons and stories about Mexico that Rosa carefully edited to remove the violence and loss. Rosa taught Sophia to make tortillas, to season beans properly, to understand that cooking was both art and science. And in those moments, she could almost imagine the children she might have had with Miguel, the family she lost along with everything else. The other workers had noticed her patience with kids, her natural teaching ability, and sometimes asked her to watch their children when parents were working, creating an unofficial daycare in the corner of the kitchen where Rosa would supervise homework and teach basic Spanish literacy to kids who were losing their native language. She never asked for extra money. The time with children filled something hollow inside her, and the gratitude from parents who rarely had anyone treat their kids with genuine respect and affection was payment enough. Sometimes late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Rosa allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she could use her education, where her knowledge mattered, where she could walk without fear and build something meaningful instead of just surviving. She thought about asylum applications and immigration lawyers, about whether enough time had passed for the cartel to forget her or whether violence like that ever really faded, about the possibility of bringing her mother and sisters north legally if she could ever establish legitimate status. But these thoughts were dangerous, hope being more painful than resignation when you lived in the shadows, and she usually shut them down before they could take root and grow into expectations that reality would only crush. Tomorrow she would wake at 4:30 again, make coffee and breakfast, accept Luke Anderson's contempt with downcast eyes, feed the crew, clean the kitchen, and disappear into invisibility for another day. It was a small life, a lesser life than the one she'd been born to live, but it was life nonetheless, and she learned to take what victories she could find. A perfect batch of tamales, Sophia's delighted laugh, the moments when she could walk the fields and remember her father's voice teaching her to read the soil like a book. For now, in this place, with these people who barely knew she existed, this was enough. It had to be enough, because the alternative was giving up entirely, and Rosa Mendez had not survived this long by being a woman who gave up. The weather forecast came through on Luke's phone at dawn on October 15th, and the words made his stomach drop like he'd swallowed ice. Freeze warning. Temperatures dropping to 28 degrees Fahrenheit tonight. Hard frost expected across central Iowa. Conditions may persist for 48 to 72 hours. He stood in his kitchen, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, mind racing through the implications as Rosa moved silently around him preparing breakfast for the crew. His corn was maybe 70% ready for harvest. The early fields were perfect, but the late planted sections still had 2 weeks of maturation time before they'd reach optimal moisture content for combining. A hard frost this early could damage the grain, reduce yields, compromise quality, cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars he absolutely could not afford to lose. Tom was already calling, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You seeing this weather? We got maybe 12 hours before it hits. We can get the combines running on the early fields, but the West 40 and the creek section ain't ready. Frost's gonna nail 'em hard." Within an hour, the farm had transformed into controlled chaos as Luke mobilized every available resource to harvest what could be saved before the temperature dropped. He'd called in equipment from neighboring farms, hired every available truck and driver within 30 miles, had crews running combines 24 hours straight in a desperate race against a thermometer that showed steady decline throughout the day. Rosa watched from the kitchen window as tractors and trucks moved like frantic insects, understanding more than Luke realized about what was at stake. She'd seen frost wipe out entire harvests in Oaxaca, knew the sickening calculus of damaged crops, and reduced prices and seasons of work destroyed by nature's indifference. She'd tripled her cooking output, making sandwiches and thermoses of coffee for workers who couldn't stop for proper meals, her own worry growing as she calculated yields and losses with the trained mind of someone who'd managed farm operations under pressure. The early fields were safe, maybe 400 acres worth $800,000 at current prices, but the remaining 400 acres, the late sections that Luke had planted hoping to spread his risk, were sitting ducks for the killing frost that was coming with the certainty of a death sentence. By afternoon, agricultural experts and crop insurance adjusters had descended on the Anderson farm like vultures sensing carrion, their clipboards and technical instruments measuring Luke's potential ruin with professional detachment. Dr. Peterson from the University Extension Service walked the late fields with Luke and Tom, his expression grave as he examined corn that was maybe 10 days from physiological maturity, so close to being safe, and yet so vulnerable. Hard frost at this stage will cause kernel damage, reduce test weight, potentially introduce mold issues, Peterson explained in the clinical tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. You're looking at 30 to 40% yield loss on anything that doesn't get harvested before the freeze hits, plus significant quality downgrades that'll cost you another 20% in price reductions. If I'm being honest, Luke, these late fields are probably a total write-off. The math was devastating. For 100 acres times 180 bushels, average yield times $4.50 per bushel meant $324,000 in gross revenue before expenses, gone, evaporated, destroyed by a weather pattern that had arrived 2 weeks earlier than historical averages predicted. Tom spat tobacco juice and cursed under his breath, knowing exactly what this meant. No matter how successful the early harvest was, losing the late fields would put Luke so deep in debt that selling wasn't just an option anymore. It was the only option. The crop insurance adjuster arrived at 3 p.m., a thin man named Morrison who'd been assessing agricultural disasters for 20 years and had the emotional detachment of someone who'd seen every form of farming catastrophe imaginable. He walked the fields with mechanical precision, taking photos, soil samples, moisture readings, documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case before the disaster had even occurred. Your policy has an 80% coverage level. Morrison explained, reading from his tablet while Luke's world crumbled around him. That means we'll pay you 80% of established yield at guaranteed price levels. For the late fields, you're looking at maybe $220,000 in insurance payout. But that's only if the frost causes complete crop failure. Partial damage gets more complicated. Luke did the math immediately. $220,000 in insurance money versus the $324,000 he'd make from a successful harvest, losing over $100,000 in a single night because Mother Nature had decided October 15th was frost time this year. Add in the money he'd already spent on seed, fertilizer, labor, equipment, and the late fields would represent a net loss of close to $200,000. Money he didn't have. Money that would push his total farm debt past the point where any bank would refinance. Money that would leave selling as literally his only path forward. Ashley arrived at sunset, her timing impeccable as always, her expression mixing sympathy and urgency in proportions that suggested she'd been rehearsing this conversation all day. "I heard about the frost warning," she said, touching his arm with practiced concern. "Luke, honey, this is exactly what I've been worried about. You're one bad weather event away from losing everything. The AgriCorp offer is still on the table, but they're getting antsy. If you don't sign by Friday, they're moving on to other properties." Luke wanted to rage, to throw something, to curse the universe that seemed determined to destroy what 6 generations of Anderson farmers had built. But rage wouldn't change the temperature forecast or save his corn or make the debt disappear. He stood in his kitchen. Rosa was in the background, cleaning up after feeding the day's shift and preparing for the night crew, and felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders like physical force. "Just sign the papers," Ashley continued, her voice soft but insistent. "Take the money. Pay off your debts. Start over. You fought so hard, but sometimes fighting just means losing more slowly. There's no shame in accepting reality." The evening brought news coverage of the freeze. Local stations running stories about frost threat to Iowa Corn Belt, with B-roll of combines racing across fields and interviews with farmers facing the same desperate calculations Luke was making. The meteorologist explained the science with cheerful enthusiasm that felt obscene given the circumstances. An Arctic front pushing south faster than expected. Clear skies allowing rapid radiational cooling. Dew point temperatures suggesting potential for hard frost formation across central Iowa by midnight. Luke watched the forecast with numb detachment, already planning for disaster, already beginning the mental process of surrender that would let him sign away his family's legacy without hating himself quite so completely. Tom had called it quits at 8 p.m. The early fields harvested and safely in grain bins. The late fields abandoned to their fate because there simply wasn't enough time or equipment to save them. "I'm sorry, Luke," Tom had said with the gruff affection of a man who'd watched Luke grow up and learn farming from his father. "We did what we could. Sometimes that just ain't enough." By 9 p.m., most of the workers had retired to bunkhouse, exhausted from 18 hours of emergency harvesting, but Rosa remained in the kitchen, preparing food for the skeleton crew that would monitor equipment through the night. She listened to the experts all day, heard their pronouncements of inevitable doom, and felt a growing frustration that she recognized as dangerous but couldn't quite suppress. She knew things these experts didn't know, understood agricultural techniques that had been developed over centuries in climates where frost was a regular threat, had watched her father and grandfather save crops that university professors had declared lost. The controlled burn technique her family had used in Oaxaca could save frost-damaged corn. She was almost certain of it. But explaining this to Luke would mean revealing knowledge she wasn't supposed to have, drawing attention she'd spent 2 years avoiding, and potentially exposing herself to questions she absolutely couldn't answer. She stood at the kitchen sink, hands in soapy water, watching Luke through the doorway as he sat at his dining table with Ashley and the AgriCorp contract spread before him, and she thought, he's going to sign. He's going to give up. And I'm going to let it happen because saying something would risk everything I've built in this invisible life. But then Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes, asking in Spanish if Rosa had any sweetbread for a bedtime snack. The little girl had drawn a picture earlier, a crayon render of the farm with smiling stick figures labeled Luke and Rosa and Papa and all the workers, and had proudly showed it to Rosa, explaining that this was her favorite place because everyone was nice and the food was good, and she didn't want to leave when harvest ended. Rose had hugged her and said nothing, fighting back the familiar ache of loss, remembering the children she'd never had with Miguel, the family farm that existed now only in memories. She built a small life here, invisible but real, and watching Luke destroy it through ignorance and pride when she had knowledge that could save everything felt suddenly, viscerally wrong. Sophia yawned, took her sweetbread, kissed Rose's cheek, and went back to bed, leaving Rose alone with a decision that terrified her more than anything had in 2 years. Speak up and risk exposure, or stay silent and watch another farm die when she had the knowledge to save it. At 10:15 p.m., Rosa dried her hands, smoothed her apron, took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff, and walked into Luke Anderson's dining room where he sat with a pen in his hand, and Ashley whispering encouragement about new beginnings and smart choices. "Mr. Anderson," Rosa said in English that was clear and confident and completely unlike the submissive broken speech she'd used for 3 months. "Don't sign that." Luke looked up, startled, as if his kitchen had suddenly started giving him business advice, his expression moving from surprise to irritation in the space of a heartbeat. "Excuse me," he said with the edge of someone being interrupted by the help, and Rosa felt every instinct screaming to retreat, apologize, return to invisibility, but she thought her father, Miguel, and the farm they died protecting, and she held her ground. "Don't sign," she repeated, meeting his eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. "I can save your late fields. I know a technique that works on frost-damaged corn, but you have to trust me, and you have to not sign those papers." Ashley laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Oh, for God's sake, Luke, you're taking farming advice from the cook now? This is ridiculous." But Luke had gone very still, looking at Rosa with new attention, seeing something in her eyes that didn't match the invisible immigrant he thought she was, and in that moment everything changed. The dining room fell into electric silence, Ashley's derisive laughter dying as she realized Luke was actually considering the interruption. Rosa standing in the doorway with her heart pounding so hard she could hear in her ears. Luke Anderson stared at this woman he'd barely noticed for 3 months, seeing for the first time the intelligence in her dark eyes, the confidence in her posture, the careful precision of her English that suggested education he'd been too arrogant to detect. "You can say frost-damaged corn," he repeated slowly, testing the words like they might be a trap or a joke. The cook I pay $9 an hour and don't ask for papers can solve a problem that University of Iowa agronomists just told me is impossible. Rosa felt a familiar shame trying to pull her back into silence, but she'd already crossed a line. Retreat now would accomplish nothing except making her look crazy, and maybe crazy was better than invisible for once in this half-life she'd been living. She stepped fully into the room, her hands clasped to stop them shaking, and said with quiet firmness, "Yes, my family has been doing it for 7 generations. It's a controlled burn technique that triggers the corn plant stress response and converts damaged starch into sugar the plant can still use. It won't save everything, but it can recover 60 to 70% of what you'd otherwise lose." Ashley's incredulity was immediate and vicious. "This is insane. Luke, she's a cook who probably doesn't even have a high school diploma, and you're going to listen to her folk remedy over actual scientists? Over people with PhDs who spent their entire career studying agriculture?" Rose absorbed the insult without flinching, having endured worse than the cartel men who destroyed her life, and kept her eyes on Luke because he was the only one who mattered in this moment. Luke's expression was shifting, confusion mixing with curiosity and maybe, just maybe, a desperate hope that someone, anyone, might have an answer that didn't involve signing away 6 generations of family legacy. "Explain it," he said abruptly, pushing the contract aside and leaning forward. "Explain exactly what you're talking about, and don't give me vague traditional knowledge bullshit. Give me the science." Rosa took another breath, reaching back through 2 years of hiding to find the voice she'd used presenting agricultural research at UNAM, the confidence she'd had when her knowledge was valued rather than dismissed. When corn experiences frost before physiological maturity, ice crystals rupture cell walls and damage the endosperm where starch is stored. The plant essentially starts dying from kernel damage. But if you apply controlled fire to the stalks within 12 hours of the frost, you trigger a stress response that releases enzymes that can convert some of the damaged starch into sugars the plant moves toward the roots for storage. You lose the damaged kernels, yes, but the remaining kernels mature faster and maintain better test weight than if you just let the frost damage continue. That's ridiculous, Ashley interjected, her voice sharp with anger that Luke was even entertaining this. You're talking about setting your cornfield on fire based on advice from help? This is exactly the kind of backwards thinking that's bankrupted this farm in the first place. But Tom had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices, and his weathered face showed interest rather than dismissal. Controlled burns, he said thoughtfully. Indigenous farmers used to do something similar in the old days, before industrial agriculture. Heard about it at a sustainability conference a couple years back. Some tribe in Minnesota or Wisconsin. Never seen it done on corn, though. Rosa nodded, grateful for any support, and continued. My family's farm was in Oaxaca, Mexico. High altitude. Early frost was a regular problem. We combined traditional indigenous techniques with modern agricultural science. My father had been working with UNAM researchers on documenting effective traditional practices. The control burn works because the fire is low and fast, hot enough to trigger the stress response, but not hot enough to damage the actual plant structure. You do it in strips, create fire breaks, monitor wind conditions. It's labor-intensive and requires precise timing, but it works. Luke's brain was clearly racing, weighing impossible choices against desperate possibilities. The logical part saying this was crazy, while another part, maybe the part that still believed in miracles, or maybe just the part that didn't want to be the Anderson who lost it all, was considering it seriously. What's your background? He asked Rosa directly, his eyes narrowed with new attention. Because you don't talk like someone whose education stopped at middle school, and you sure as hell don't talk like someone who just knows how to cook. This was the moment Rosa had feared for 2 years, the question that would require truth or lies, revelation or continued hiding. And she'd already stepped too far into the light to retreat back into shadow now. She met his gaze steadily and made a choice that would either save her or destroy her. I have a degree in agricultural sciences from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico in Mexico City. My family owned 200 acres of sustainable farmland in Oaxaca. I managed our operation for 3 years, implementing precision agriculture techniques and traditional indigenous practices. I was good at it. The room went completely silent, Ashley's mouth literally hanging open, Tom's eyes wide with surprise. Luke staring at Rosa as if she just announced she was secretly the president of Mexico. So you're telling me, Luke said slowly, anger starting to creep into his voice, that for 3 months I've had someone with a university degree in agriculture cooking my meals and feeding my crew, and you never thought to mention this? Rosa felt a familiar shame mixing with newer anger. 2 years of swallowing disrespect suddenly rising up her throat like bile. You never asked, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion. You looked at me and saw an illegal Mexican cook who wasn't worth your attention. You paid me cash under the table and spoke to me in bad Spanish like I was a child. Would you have listened if I'd tried to tell you anything? Would you have cared? The truth of it hung in the air, undeniable and uncomfortable, Luke's face flushing because she was absolutely right. He'd made assumptions based on her appearance and position, had treated her as invisible and interchangeable, had never considered that the woman making his breakfast might know more about farming than he did. Ashley recovered first, her expression shifting from shock to calculation. This is irrelevant. Even if she has some degree from some Mexican university, she's been lying about who she is. She's probably illegal. And you cannot seriously be considering agricultural advice from someone who's committed immigration fraud and has been deceiving you for months. But Tom cut him before Luke could respond, his old farmer's wisdom overriding social conventions. Actually, I'd like to hear more about this controlled burn technique. Because the way I see it, Luke, you got 2 choices. Sign them papers and give up for sure, or try something that might work, and worst case you lose fields you were going to lose anyway. He looked at Rosa with the respect one professional gives another. You really think you can save 60 to 70%? Rosa didn't hesitate. Yes, I've seen it done multiple times. It's not a miracle and it's not magic. It's applied agricultural science combined with traditional knowledge that's been tested over centuries. But we need to move fast. The frost hits at midnight. We need to implement the burns by dawn tomorrow before the plant stress becomes irreversible. Luke stood up abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. Every instinct he'd been raised was screaming that this was insane, while another part of his brain, the part that understood his options had narrowed to this single desperate gamble, was already making calculations. "What would you need?" he asked Rosa, and Ashley made a sound of pure outrage. "Luke, no. You cannot seriously be. This is career suicide. Your insurance won't cover experimental techniques. You could make everything worse, and you're trusting someone who's been lying to you." Rosa ignored Ashley entirely, focusing on Luke with laser intensity because this was her one chance to speak with authority, to use the knowledge she kept locked away, to maybe, finally, stop being invisible. "I need your full harvest crew, every worker you can get by dawn. I need farm equipment for creating fire breaks, your disc harrows and field cultivators. I need accelerant but controlled. We can use the dried corn stalks from your early harvest as fuel. Most importantly, I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. This technique requires precision, wrong timing, wrong wind conditions, wrong fire intensity, and yes, we could make it worse." She paused and added with absolute honesty, "But Mr. Anderson, you're going to lose those fields anyway if you do nothing. Dr. Peterson already told you that. The insurance payout will be less than half what a successful harvest would bring. You're losing the farm either way unless something changes. I'm offering you a change. A chance. It might not work, but at least it's a chance instead of guaranteed failure." Luke looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, seeing not the invisible cook, but a woman who'd somehow compressed a lifetime of knowledge into 3 months of silence, and he made the kind of impulsive decision that either saved family legacies or destroyed them completely. "Okay, we try it. Tom, get the crew up and ready by 4 a.m. Rosa, you're in charge of this operation. Tell us what you need, and we'll make it happen." Ashley exploded. "This is beyond stupid. It's negligent. Luke, I'm begging you, don't do this. Sign the papers, take the guaranteed money, and stop gambling with money you don't have." But Luke had already turned away from her, the contracts forgotten on the table, his attention entirely on Rosa and Tom as they started planning the impossible attempt to save his late fields through a technique that combined science and tradition in ways that made his agricultural degree from Iowa State seem suddenly inadequate. Rosa felt adrenaline surging through her system. The familiar high of crisis management that she hadn't felt since Mexico, her mind automatically organizing tasks and priorities and resource allocation with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "We have 6 hours until frost," she said crisply, "and about 8 hours from frost to optimal burn time. That gives us 2 hours of sleep at most. Mr. Anderson, I need you to show me detailed maps of your late fields, topography, drainage patterns, wind breaks, everything. Tom, I need a full equipment inventory and worker count. We're going to need to move very fast once dawn comes." Luke nodded, already moving toward his office and the farm maps, while Ashley stood alone in the dining room, her carefully constructed plan falling apart, her finder's fee evaporating, her future with Luke suddenly uncertain as he listened to the immigrant cook with more intensity than he'd shown his fiancée in months. The next hours blurred into focused preparation, Rosa shedding years of invisibility, like a snake shedding skin, her voice confident and authoritative as she walked Luke and Tom through the plan. She sketched diagrams showing fire patterns and wind considerations, explained the science of plant stress responses with the precision of someone who'd studied it academically, and demonstrated knowledge of Luke's farm that shocked him because it meant she'd been paying attention to details he'd never noticed she noticed. "Your northwest 40 has better drainage. We'll start there first," she explained, pointing at the map. "The creek section is trickier because of variable moisture. We'll need to adjust burn intensity based on ground conditions. And we absolutely cannot do this if wind speed goes above 15 miles per hour, or if there's any significant shift in direction. That turns controlled burn into wildfire." Luke listened, asked questions that revealed his own solid agricultural knowledge, and gradually shifted from skepticism to cautious hope, recognizing professional competence when he saw it, even if it came from a source he'd never expected. Tom was openly impressed, making notes and asking technical questions about temperature thresholds and timing protocols, treating Rosa as the agricultural expert she actually was. At 2 a.m., Rosa finally let herself think about what she'd just done, the enormous risk she'd taken by revealing herself, the questions that would inevitably come about her legal status and her past. Ashley had left in fury around midnight, threatening consequences and warning Luke he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But Luke had barely noticed her departure, too focused on survival to care about her outrage. Now he sat across from Rose at his kitchen table, farm maps between them, and asked the question she'd been dreading. Why didn't you tell me sooner about your education, your experience? Why work as a cook for $9 an hour when you could have, I don't know, done something better? Rosa looked down at her hands, worn from physical labor, and decided that partial truth was safer than complete revelation. I have immigration issues, she said carefully. My credentials aren't recognized here, and my legal status is complicated. I needed work that didn't ask questions. You needed a cook who'd work cheap. It seemed like a fair arrangement. Luke absorbed this, his expression unreadable. You're undocumented. It wasn't a question. Rosa nodded once, bracing for rejection or threats. But instead, Luke said something that surprised her. After tomorrow, if this works, that changes. I'll sponsor your work visa, help you get legal status. Someone with your knowledge shouldn't be hiding. Rosa felt tears threaten for the first time in months, the unexpected kindness hitting harder than any insult. But she blinked them back and simply said, Let's save your farm first. Then we can talk about my future. The October dawn broke cold and clear, frost sparkling across the unharvested cornfields like diamond dust, each crystal marking the cellular damage that conventional wisdom said was irreversible. Luke's crew assembled at 4:30 a.m. 40 workers total, counting the emergency labor Tom had recruited from neighboring farms. Their breaths steaming in the freezing air as Rosa stood before them explaining a technique most had never heard of. She spoke in Spanish first for the immigrant workers, her voice carrying authority that made several of them exchange surprised glances, then switched to English for the Iowa farmers who'd shown up skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. We're going to implement controlled burns in strips perpendicular to prevailing wind direction, Rose explained, using a whiteboard Tom had set up in the machinery barn. Fire temperature needs to stay between 400 and 600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to trigger stress response, but not so hot we damage root systems. Timing is critical. Burns must occur between 6 and 8 hours post-frost for optimal enzyme activation. She saw doubt on some faces, belief on others, but mostly she saw people who understood that farming sometimes required trusting knowledge that seemed impossible, and this morning impossible was their best and only option. The first field was a test. 20 acres of the Northwest 40 that Rosa had chosen for its relatively uniform conditions and good natural fire breaks. Luke watched with his heart in his throat as Rosa's crews created firebreak strips using disc harrows, sectioning the field into manageable burn zones, then carefully placed dried corn stalk fuel in precisely measured amounts along the fire lines. She'd stationed workers with water tanks and fire beaters every 30 yards, checked wind speed and direction 3 times, and consulted a thermal imaging camera Tom had borrowed from a volunteer fire department to monitor ground temperature. At 6:15 a.m., exactly 6 hours and 20 minutes after the frost had hit, Rosa gave the signal, and workers touched flame to the first fire line, sending a control wave of orange heat racing across the frosted corn stalks with a sound like a dragon's whisper. The fire moved fast, exactly as Rosa had predicted, burning the lower stalks and frost-damaged leaves, but leaving the main plants intact, the flames creating a temperature surge that stressed the corn plants in precisely the way Rosa's family had understood for generations. Luke stood beside Rosa as they watched the first burn, his entire net worth riding on whether this crazy technique would work or just add fire damage to frost damage and complete his ruin. The fire was beautiful and terrifying, controlled chaos that required constant monitoring, workers moving with practiced efficiency to keep flames contained and ensure even heat distribution across the 20-acre section. Rosa called out adjustments in Spanish and English. Slow down the east line, wind shifting, and more fuel on the west. We're running too cold. Her confidence evident in every command. Her expertise impossible to dismiss, even if yesterday Luke would have said the Mexican cook couldn't possibly know more about farming than Iowa agronomists. When the first section completed its burn cycle, roughly 45 minutes from ignition to cool down, Rosa walked the field with Luke and Tom, examining the corn plants for stress indicators that would tell her if the technique was working. The The plants looked traumatized, leaves singed and lower stalks blackened, but the main structure remained intact, and Rosa's trained eye saw what others couldn't. The subtle shift in kernel color that indicated the stress enzymes were activating, converting damaged starch into mobile sugars exactly as the science predicted. We won't know for certain until we harvest and test grain quality. Rosa explained as they stood in the cooling field, smoke still drifting across rows of scorched-looking corn. But the initial stress response is positive. The plants are adapting rather than just dying. That's the key difference. We've given them a way to salvage the frost damage instead of just surrendering to it. Tom bent down, pulled an ear, examined the kernels with the practiced eye of someone who'd been evaluating corn quality for 40 years, and nodded slowly. I'll be damned. Some of these kernels are already showing better fill than I'd expect from frost-damaged corn. It's like the plant decided to mature faster, to say what it could. Luke felt hope surging through him for the first time since the frost warning, dangerous and intoxicating, making him almost afraid to believe because belief made failure hurt worse. But he looked at Rosa, really looked at her, seeing not the invisible cook but the agricultural scientist who'd been hiding in plain sight, and made a decision. Continue. We do all 400 acres. Whatever you need, you've got it. The next 6 hours became a masterclass in precision agriculture executed under impossible time pressure. Rosa coordinating multiple burn teams across 4 separate fields, while monitoring wind conditions, fire intensity, ground moisture, and a dozen other variables that could turn controlled burns into disaster. She'd assigned team leaders from the more experienced workers, including one the crew boss, and a grizzled Iowa farmer named Dale, who'd admitted he'd seen indigenous farmers use similar techniques 70 years ago when he was a boy. The crews moved with military precision. Fire break teams working ahead of burn teams, water safety teams monitoring for any loss of control, harvest equipment staged, and ready to move into cooled sections for immediate combining. Rosa was everywhere at once, checking thermal readings, adjusting burn patterns, teaching workers to recognize stress indicators in the corn plants, her UNAM education and family tradition combining into practical expertise that Luke had never seen in action before. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that she revealed herself for this, had risked everything she'd carefully constructed over 2 years, and the only way to justify that risk was to succeed so completely that her value became undeniable. By noon, they'd successfully burned and treated 280 acres, with Rosa's confidence growing as each section showed positive stress response indicators. The workers had started to believe. Luke could see it in their movements, hear it in their conversations, feeling the energy that had shifted from desperate last stand to maybe we can actually pull this off. The immigrant workers especially seemed energized. Several mentioned that their own families in Mexico or Central America used similar techniques, validating Rosa's traditional knowledge in ways that made the Iowa farmers pay closer attention. Luke brought Rosa water and sandwiches at 1 p.m., insisting she take a 15-minute break, and found himself asking questions about her family's farm, her education, her journey to this moment, starting to see her as a person rather than a function. Rosa answered carefully, still guarding the most dangerous parts of her story, but allowed herself to share enough that Luke began to understand what he'd been too arrogant to see. She'd been surviving by making herself invisible, and he'd been cruel by never looking hard enough to see through the invisibility. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, as word spread through the agricultural community about the crazy controlled burn experiment on the Anderson farm. Dr. Peterson from the University Extension showed up at 2 p.m., initially skeptical but becoming progressively more interested as Rosa explained the science and walked him through the treated sections. This is remarkable, he admitted, examining corn plants that showed clear stress adaptation response. I've read about similar techniques in indigenous agricultural literature, but I've never seen it implemented at commercial scale. Where did you say you studied? Rosa met his gaze steadily. UNAM in Mexico City. Agricultural sciences with focus on sustainable practices and traditional knowledge integration. Peterson blinked, clearly recalibrating his assumptions. UNAM has one of the best agricultural programs in Latin America. Their research on traditional farming techniques is internationally recognized. He turned to Luke. You've got an actual expert running this operation. I hope you're paying her appropriately. Luke had the grace to look embarrassed. Working on that, he muttered, while Rosa suppressed a smile at his discomfort. feeling a small satisfaction that at least someone was recognizing her credentials mattered. By 4 p.m., all 400 acres had been treated. The control burns completed with 0 accidents, and what appeared to be strong positive results across every section. Rosa stood on a rise overlooking the treated fields, exhausted but exhilarated, feeling more alive than she had in 2 years of hiding and pretending and making herself small. The corn plants looked battered, their lower stalks blackened and their leaves singed, but they stood tall and showed the telltale signs of stress adaptation that meant the technique was working. They were converting frost damage into salvageable yield, exactly as her father had taught her they would. Luke joined her on the rise, Tom beside him, and for a moment all three just stood there looking at what they'd accomplished through a combination of desperation, traditional knowledge, and willingness to try something impossible. We won't know final yield numbers for another week, Rosa said quietly, but based on visual assessment, I estimate we've saved 65 to 70% of what would have been total loss. That's roughly $230,000 in additional gross revenue compared to the insurance payout. Luke did the math immediately. Combined with the early fields they'd harvested before the frost, he'd gross around $1.8 million, enough to pay down significant debt and survive another year, enough to keep the farm and tell Ashley and AgriCorp exactly where they could shove their buyout offer. The crew celebrated that evening with an impromptu cookout that Rosa organized, grilling carne asada and serving rice and beans and fresh tortillas. The workers sharing stories and laughter after a day that started with impossible challenge and ended with unexpected triumph. Luke joined them, something he'd never done before, sitting with the crew and eating Rosa's food and listening to conversations in Spanish that Tom occasionally translated, beginning to see these workers as people rather than labor units. Sophia brought Rosa her crayon drawing from earlier, insisting Luke sign it as a thank you for letting Rosa save the farm. And Luke had smiled and complied, meeting Rosa's eyes across the fire with something that looked like gratitude and maybe a little bit of shame. Dr. Peterson had stayed for the celebration, fascinated by Rosa's knowledge and peppering her with questions about traditional techniques and sustainable agriculture, treating her with the professional respect she'd been denied for 2 years. Have you considered publishing your family's techniques? Peterson asked. This controlled burn adaptation could revolutionize frost protection across the Midwest. We're looking at climate change making these early frosts more common. Your knowledge could save hundreds of farms. Rosa felt a familiar fear rising. Publication meant exposure. Exposure meant questions about legal status. Questions led to deportation. But she also felt something else. The desire to matter, to contribute, to use her knowledge for more than just survival. As the evening wound down and workers drifted off to bed, Luke asked Rosa to walk with him through the treated fields, and she agreed despite her exhaustion. They walked in silence for a while, their boots crunching on frost-crisp soil, the smell of smoke still lingering in the cold air, until Luke finally spoke. I'm sorry for how I treated you, for the assumptions I made, for paying you $9 an hour when you're worth 10 times that. You saved my farm today, and I've been... He trailed off, searching for words. Rosa supplied them. An arrogant ass who couldn't see past his own prejudices? Luke winced but nodded. Yeah, that. But I'd like to change that, if you'll let me. I meant what I said about sponsoring your work visa. You should be farm manager, not cook. You should be using your education, and you should be paid fairly. Rosa felt the tears she'd suppressed all day threatening to surface. Why? Because I saved your farm? Because I proved I was useful? Luke stopped walking, turned to face her. No, because it's the right thing to do, and because I was wrong. You shouldn't have to save a farm to be treated like a human being who deserves respect. The simple honesty of it broke through Rosa's defenses, and she let herself cry for the first time in months. 2 years of humiliation and fear and invisibility pouring out while Luke stood awkwardly nearby, eventually putting a hesitant hand on her shoulder in comfort that was clumsy but genuine. The harvest of the frost-treated fields began 5 days later, Rosa's prediction of optimal timing proving accurate as combines rolled through corn that testing showed maintained surprisingly high test weight and quality despite the early frost trauma. Luke stood in his grain bins calculating yields that exceeded even his hopeful expectations. The treated sections were averaging 145 bushels per acre instead of the 180 They have gotten without frost, but catastrophically better than the 50 to 60 bushels that frost-damaged corn normally produced. Tom ran the numbers 3 times, disbelieving, before accepting that Rosa's technique had indeed saved approximately 70% of what conventional wisdom said was lost, roughly $250,000 in additional gross revenue that would keep the farm solvent and Luke out of Ashley's carefully laid trap. Word spread fast through Iowa's agricultural community. Farmers and extension agents showing up unannounced to see the miracle corn and ask Rosa questions about implementation. And she found herself giving impromptu seminars in Luke's machinery barn to groups of skeptical but desperate farmers who'd been told industrial agriculture was the only path forward. Dr. Peterson had returned multiple times, now bringing colleagues from Iowa State and the USDA who examined the treated fields with scientific rigor and emerging consensus that Rosa's technique represented legitimate agricultural innovation worth studying and documenting. They'd asked her to present findings at the Midwest Agricultural Conference in December, to publish a paper describing the methodology, to consider consulting contracts with the Extension Service, offers that terrified Rosa, because professional visibility meant questions about immigration status and background checks she absolutely couldn't pass. She deflected gracefully, claiming she needed time to organize her data, while privately panicking about how success might destroy her even as it validated everything she'd sacrificed. Luke had been true to his word about changing her position and pay, promoting her to agricultural operations consultant at $75,000 salary plus percentage of yield improvements, moving her from the worker housing into the farmhouse's guest room, and beginning work visa sponsorship paperwork through an immigration attorney who'd assured them the process would take months but was achievable. For the first time in 2 years, Rosa allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't just survival. Legal status, professional recognition, maybe even the ability to bring her mother and sisters to safety. Ashley's reaction to these developments was volcanic when she finally returned to the farm, her Mercedes roaring up the driveway on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the frost treatment. She'd heard through her bank contacts about the successful harvest, Luke's improved financial position, and his refusal to return her calls about the AgriCorp sale, and she'd come prepared for confrontation with the righteousness of someone whose careful planning had been derailed by variables she hadn't anticipated. Luke was in the fields with Tom when she arrived, so Ashley found Rosa in the farmhouse kitchen. Now Rosa's professional workspace, complete with laptop and agricultural reference materials, and unleashed 2 years of condescension without filter. "You think you're so smart," Ashley spat, her designer clothes and expensive perfume incongruous in the utilitarian farmhouse. "Coming in here with your sob story and your convenient expertise, manipulating Luke when he was vulnerable. I know what you are, an illegal immigrant who committed fraud, lied about her credentials, and is probably running from something criminal in Mexico. You're nothing but a con artist who got lucky." Rosa felt a familiar shame trying to surface, but pushed it down with new confidence built from 3 weeks of respect and professional recognition, meeting Ashley's glare with calm dignity. "I saved Luke's farm using knowledge I earned through years of education and experience," Rosa said evenly. "I asked for nothing except a chance to help. If that threatens you, maybe examine why you need Luke to fail in order to feel successful." Ashley's laugh was harsh. "Oh, please. You asked for nothing because you're illegal and desperate. The moment Luke doesn't need you anymore, you'll be right back where you started, invisible and worthless. You're a temporary solution to a problem, not a real partner, and Luke will figure that out eventually." Rose absorbed the venom with outward calm while her mind raced through worst-case scenarios, because Ashley was right about one thing. Her legal status remained precarious, her past remained hidden, and revelation could still destroy everything. But before she could respond, Luke walked into the kitchen, having heard the last part of Ashley's tirade, and his expression was colder than Rosa had ever seen it. "Get out, Ashley. We're done." The confrontation that followed was ugly, Ashley alternating between tears and rage, trying every manipulation tactic she perfected over 2 years of their relationship. She claimed to love Luke and want what was best for him, accused Rosa of being a gold digger seducing him for visa sponsorship, threatened to report Rosa to immigration authorities if Luke didn't reconsider the AgriCorp sale, and finally revealed the truth Luke had suspected but hadn't confirmed. Her bank had been deliberately sabotaging his loan refinancing applications as part of conspiracy with AgriCorp to force family farmers into selling at distressed prices. The bank gave me a $200,000 finder's fee for every farm I steered toward AgriCorp, Ashley admitted in her rage, no longer bothering to hide the corruption. You were supposed to be easy. 3 bad harvests, massive debt, no options. But then this Mexican bitch showed up and ruined everything. Luke's face went white with rage and betrayal, understanding finally how deeply Ashley had been working against him while pretending to support him. He pulled out his phone and started recording. "Say that again about the finder's fees and deliberate loan sabotage," he said quietly, and Ashley, caught in her fury, repeated it all while Rosa watched Luke document his fiancée's confession to bank fraud and conspiracy. Within hours, Luke had contacted his attorney, filed complaints with the State Banking Commission and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, and provided evidence of Ashley's confession along with documentation Tom had helped compile showing systematic loan sabotage across multiple family farms. The scandal exploded across Iowa's agricultural and banking communities within days. Ashley was fired and arrested. Her bank's CEO resigned under investigation. AgriCorp was facing federal scrutiny for conspiracy and anti-competitive practices, and Luke's farm became ground zero for a reckoning about predatory lending practices targeting family farmers. Rosa watched it unfold with mixed emotions, glad that justice was being served, but terrified that increased attention on Luke's farm meant increased attention on her, and attention was the last thing an undocumented immigrant needed. She'd started having nightmares about ICE agents showing up during one of her agricultural seminars, about her past catching up through databases and background checks, about losing everything just when she started to believe in futures instead of just survival. The media attention was relentless. Local news, agricultural journals, even a feature in the Des Moines Register about the immigrant agricultural expert who saved an Iowa farm. Rosa participated reluctantly, using only her first name and carefully avoiding details about her background, but each article felt like painting a target on her back for immigration enforcement or, worse, for the cartel members who'd force her to flee Mexico. She confided some of this fear to Luke one evening as they reviewed harvest data, and he surprised her by sharing his own discovery. During the visa sponsorship process, his immigration attorney had mentioned that Rosa might qualify for asylum based on cartel violence and her family's persecution for resisting land theft. "It's a path to legal status," Luke explained carefully, "but it would require you to document what happened in Mexico to tell your full story. I know that's asking a lot, asking you to relive trauma and risk exposure, but it might be your best chance at permanent protection." Rosa had listened in silence, her mind spinning through implications, weighing the terror of revelation against the possibility of actually being safe, legally present, able to live without constantly looking over her shoulder. Sophia's mother Maria was the one who finally convinced Rosa to pursue the asylum application, sitting with her in the farmhouse kitchen one evening while the little girl did homework nearby. "I watch you with Sophia," Maria said in Spanish, "and I see someone who should have children of her own, a family, a real life instead of this hiding. You saved Luke's farm. You have power now, influence. Use it to save yourself too. Tell your story. Get legal status. Bring your mother and sisters here, where the cartels can't reach them. Stop surviving and start living." Rosa looked at Sophia, bent over her schoolwork, and thought about the children she'd never had with Miguel, the family that had been stolen from her, and made a decision. She would file for asylum, would document the violence and land theft and murders, would risk everything on the possibility that America's legal system might actually protect someone like her. The asylum application was filed 2 weeks later, representing Rosa's full story, including her family's farm, her father's and fiancé's murders, the cartel's land theft, and her 2-year flight through the underground network that brought refugees north. And for the first time since Mexico, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, possibly, she could stop running. The asylum process brought federal investigators to Iowa, documenting Rosa's case as part of a broader investigation into cartel violence and land theft in Oaxaca. Rosa sat through depositions that forced her to relive her father's execution, Miguel's death, her desperate flight north, every detailed trauma she'd locked away to function, and each session left her emotionally shattered but strangely lighter, as if speaking the truth was lancing an infected wound. Luke attended every deposition, providing moral support and documentation of Rosa's agricultural expertise and community contribution, and something shifted between them during those difficult weeks. Professional respect deepening into personal connection, shared dinners becoming comfortable routine, conversations extending into late evenings where they talked about everything except the obvious attraction building between them. Sophia had noticed, asking Rosa in innocent childlike directness why she and Luke didn't just get married like in the movies, and Rosa had laughed and deflected while her heart ached with the impossibility of it. She was his employee, an undocumented immigrant in asylum limbo, a woman with too much trauma and too uncertain a future to risk love even if Luke felt the same way. But Luke did feel the same way, finally confessing it one November evening as they walked the harvested fields under cold stars, his breath steaming in the freezing air as he struggled to find words for feelings that had grown despite his best efforts to remain professional. "I know the timing is terrible," he said awkwardly, "and I know you have every reason not to trust men who treated you the way I did when we first met. But Rosa, you're the most remarkable person I've ever known, brilliant and brave and kind despite everything that's tried to break you. When I think about the future of this farm, I can't imagine it without you, not just as operations manager, but as more, if you'll have me, if I haven't screwed this up too badly already." Rosa felt tears starting, happiness and terror mixing in equal measure, because she wanted this, wanted Luke and stability and the possibility of home, but also feared it with a superstitious dread of someone who'd learned that good things got taken away violently. "I'm broken," she whispered. "My past is broken. My legal status is uncertain. I have nightmares where they come for me and kill everyone I care about. You deserve someone whole, someone without all this damage." Luke stepped closer, gently taking her hand. "We're all broken in different ways. You put my farm back together. Maybe we can put each other back together, too." The day after Luke's confession, Ashley's attorney filed a motion claiming Rosa had used undue influence on Luke during his emotional distress, suggesting the asylum application was fraudulent and designed to gain permanent residency through visa fraud. The motion was legally baseless but publicly damaging, giving local media a salacious angle. Illegal immigrant seduces farmer accused of visa fraud scheme. Ashley had been released on bail pending her fraud trial and had apparently decided that if she was going down, she'd take Rosa with her through character assassination and weaponized immigration politics. Conservative media picked up the story, framing it as criminal illegal uses sob story to manipulate American farmer, while progressive media countered with immigrant expert saves farm, faces xenophobic attacks, and Rosa found herself at the center of a political firestorm she spent 2 years trying desperately to avoid. The harassment started small, angry emails and social media comments, but escalated quickly to protesters showing up at Luke's farm demanding Rosa's deportation, to death threats that required police involvement, to conspiracy theories claiming she was a cartel plant or foreign agent sent to corrupt American agriculture. Luke's response was immediate and fierce, hiring a publicist and crisis management team to counter the narrative, giving interviews where he detailed exactly how Rosa had saved his farm and how Ashley's fraud had targeted dozens of Iowa families. He appeared on local news and agricultural podcasts, presenting Rosa as the agricultural expert she was in himself, as the arrogant American who'd almost destroyed his family legacy through prejudice and pride. "Rosa Mendez saved my farm using knowledge that combined traditional agricultural wisdom with modern science," Luke stated in a press conference covered by regional media. "She asked for nothing, risked her safety to help, and has contributed more to Iowa agriculture in 3 months than some people do in their entire careers." The real fraud here is Ashley Harper and the bank that systematically targeted struggling farmers for corporate takeover. Rosa is the victim being blamed to distract from the actual criminals. The message resonated with farming communities who'd experienced similar predatory lending, creating a groundswell of support that countered the xenophobic attacks. But the damage was done. Rosa's face was now nationally recognized, her story public, her asylum application under microscopic scrutiny that made approval seem increasingly unlikely. The USDA had scheduled a site visit to Luke's farm to evaluate Rosa's control burn technique for potential inclusion in federal agricultural guidelines, but Ashley's allies at the State Banking Commission and among AgriCorp's investors pressured the agency to cancel, claiming they wouldn't validate an illegal aliens folk methods with federal endorsement. Luke fought back by inviting the press to what became a public demonstration of the technique, with Dr. Peterson and Iowa State researchers providing scientific credibility and dozens of farmers who'd successfully implemented Rosa's methods testifying to its effectiveness. Rosa stood before the cameras and explained the science in clear, precise English, her UNAM credentials displayed prominently, her expertise undeniable to anyone willing to listen, but she knew that facts mattered less than narratives in political fights. And the narrative Ashley's legal team was pushing was illegal immigrant manipulating system for personal gain. The demonstration succeeded in swaying public opinion among agricultural communities, but federal officials remained cautious, unwilling to fully endorse techniques associated with an asylum seeker whose status remained uncertain. The breaking point came when someone leaked Rosa's asylum application to anti-immigration websites, complete with details about her family's murders and her flight from cartel violence, information that was supposed to be confidential but had somehow ended up public. Conservative commentators questioned the truthfulness of her story, calling it too convenient, and suggesting she'd fabricated cartel persecution to game the asylum system, while others used her father's execution to argue that Mexico was too dangerous for any immigration and borders should be completely closed. Rosa read the comments dissecting her trauma, calling her a liar, suggesting her father Miguel deserved her death for resisting legitimate business interests, and felt something break inside her. A limit reached, a tolerance exceeded. She'd survived 2 years of invisibility, had revealed herself to save Luke's farm, had endured harassment and death threats, but watching strangers mock her father's murder while politicians use her story to justify cruelty against other immigrants was too much. She wrote a resignation letter at midnight, packing her few possessions and planning to disappear back into the underground network that had brought her north, choosing invisibility over this public crucifixion. Luke found her at dawn, packed bag beside her bed, letter on his desk explaining that she couldn't let her presence destroy everything he'd worked to save, that she was grateful but had to go before she became a liability he couldn't afford. He read the letter, looked at her tear-stained face, and said something that surprised her. No, absolutely not. We fight this together and we win. Rosa shook her head. Luke, you don't understand. They're going to use me to destroy you. Ashley's lawyers are already trying to tie you to my visa fraud scheme. The USDA won't endorse our techniques while I'm involved. Farmers are getting harassed for defending me. I'm toxic, and the smart thing is for me to disappear before I take you down with me. Luke sat beside her, took her hands. The smart thing is for powerful people to never face consequences, for victims to always run and hide, for injustice to win because fighting is hard. My great-great-grandfather broke this land during Reconstruction when everyone said the South was finished. My grandfather held on during Depression when banks foreclosed on 90% of Iowa farms. I'm not letting Ashley Harper and her corrupt friends win because they're willing to be cruel and we're too afraid to fight back. The counteroffensive began that morning, with Luke using every political and agricultural contact he had to expose Ashley's fraud, the bank's conspiracy, AgriCorp's predatory tactics, and Rosa's legitimate expertise. Lawsuits were filed, scientists published an open letter defending Rosa, and farmers organized protests demanding accountability. Maria and the immigrant workers spoke publicly about Rosa's kindness and integrity, while Sophia's innocent viral video reframed Rosa as a teacher rather than a threat. Then ProPublica released a devastating expose showing how Heartland First Bank and Ashley had engineered forced sales of dozens of family farms for profit. Public opinion shifted overnight. Federal prosecutors expanded their investigation, and Rosa was no longer seen as a suspect, but as the whistleblower who had uncovered massive corruption. Desperate, Ashley accused Rosa of being a cartel agent during her bail hearing. The claim made headlines but was immediately investigated and discredited by the FBI. Though exhausted and shaken, Rosa refused to be silenced. At her asylum hearing, witnesses testified to her expertise, her character, and the documented murder of her family by cartels. Evidence overwhelmed every accusation, and the judge granted her asylum, scolding Ashley's attorney for malicious defamation. Outside the courthouse, Rosa felt the impossible become real. She was finally legal, safe, and seen. In the quiet of Luke's kitchen that night, she admitted how afraid she was to believe it. Luke reminded her she had always mattered. The paperwork had just caught up to the truth. Life quickly transformed. Rosa signed contracts, earned a salary and profit share, and moved into Luke's room, choosing love over fear. The USDA formally endorsed her agricultural methods. Iowa State hired her as a consultant, and farmers across the Midwest adopted her techniques. Luke proposed in the fields where her work had first saved the farm, and they married in the barn surrounded by workers, scientists, and family. Mexican-American, united by shared respect for the land. Rosa became pregnant, then gave birth to twins in November. As she held them, she reflected on the journey from Oaxaca to Iowa, from hunted refugee to mother and farm partner. Luke promised their children would grow up honoring both her family's wisdom and his own roots. Ashley was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. AgriCorp paid millions in settlements, and new banking laws protected family farms. Rosa's foundation began helping other immigrant agricultural experts gain recognition, instead of being forced into invisibility. On a cold November evening, their farmhouse filled with laughter, tamales, children, and friends. Rosa held her daughter while Luke held their son, watching the community she had helped build thrive. Years later, her family joined her in Iowa, and her work expanded across the Americas, preserving indigenous agricultural knowledge that violence had once tried to erase. On the twins' third birthday, the USDA dedicated a research station in Rosa's name on Luke's farm. In her speech, she honored her father and grandmother, reminding everyone that land remembers those who care for it. That night, standing beside Luke, watching her children play, she reflected on everything she had survived and everything she had built. When Luke asked what she was grateful for, Rosa looked at her family, her home, and the life she had earned and said simply, everything.